Good evening. My name is Nancy Bliss, and welcome to the League of Women Voters of Montgomery County, Maryland's program, Affordable Housing in Montgomery County Will Thrive Montgomery 2050 Actually Help. The population in Montgomery County is expected to increase substantially over the next several decades, resulting in an ever greater demand for already scarce affordable housing. This is especially true for low-income households. Thrive Montgomery 2050 offers a framework for diversifying the housing stock in Montgomery County across incomes, building types, and geography. But will that framework enable the county to fully address the unmet need of its residents? Tonight's panelists will give us insight into how this plan would work and what's at stake for residents in Montgomery County. But first, some housekeeping details. This webinar is presented by the League of Women Voters of Montgomery County. The meeting is being recorded and is being streamed live to Facebook. The recording will be made available at a later date on our YouTube channel. The audience will be muted during the webinar. After our speakers make their presentations, we will have a Q&A session. We encourage you to ask questions, but want to remind everyone to be respectful of our speakers and each other. To submit a question, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Type your answer into the box, then hit send or return. We will answer as many questions as time allows. The program is scheduled to end at 8:30 p.m. Now, I am pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Lisa Gavoni is a housing partner at the Montgomery County Planning Department, serving as the lead on major housing-related projects for the planning department, including long-range sector planning activities and policy and zoning changes related to housing. Prior to working at the planning department, Lisa worked as a planner for the Delaware State Housing Authority and the Calvert County Planning Department. Lisa completed her bachelor's in government and politics, as well as her master's in community planning and in geographic information systems, all from the University of Maryland, College Park. Robert Goldman is president of the Montgomery Housing Partnership, a nonprofit which acquires, develops, and manages affordable housing projects in and around the county. Before joining MHP, he was a senior development officer at Enterprise Community Investment, Inc. He earned his law degree from UCLA and a bachelor's in public policy and economics from Duke University. Stacy Spann is president and chief executive officer of MidCity, a developer of multifamily housing and mixed-use properties in the DC metro region. Before that, he was the executive director of the Housing Opportunities Commission, prior to which he was the executive director and director of Howard County Housing, as well as assistant commissioner for development finance at Baltimore Housing. He earned a master's of public administration in advanced management and finance from Columbia University and a bachelor's in business administration from Morehouse College. It is my pleasure to invite Lisa Gavoni to begin tonight's program.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Lisa Gavoni, and I work on housing policy for the planning department. Tonight, I'm going to give a short presentation on the housing policies and practices that are in the county's general plan update, Thrive Montgomery 2050. My goal tonight is to discuss what a general plan is, how we approach the housing element, and to provide an overview of the content of the housing element in Thrive Montgomery 2050, titled Housing for All. So I thought it would be helpful to start with what a general plan like Thrive Montgomery 2050 is. A general plan is a policy document that guides over multiple decades how a jurisdiction will develop and change over time and how we respond to future opportunities and challenges. A general plan is a long-term vision with broad policies that will guide future, more detailed land use planning, public investments in infrastructure, community amenities, and private development. Unlike a sector plan or master plan or a functional plan, a general plan does not provide specific land use guidance to address short-term issues in targeted geographic areas. It does not change zoning, and it addresses multiple topic areas rather than one. And a general plan is not self-implementing. So to have its ideas implemented, it requires things like zoning text amendments, sector plans, capital budget items, and legislative changes. So I'm going to start with equity. There's been a lot that's been said about what the plan says or doesn't say about equity. And so I want to talk a little bit about how it's integrated in the plan. Equity is integrated. The guidance contained in Thrive Montgomery 2050 across multiple topics is intended to accomplish 3 broad outcomes for the county's future. The first is economic health, the second is environmental resilience, and the third is equity, where the intent is that we want to create a place where all residents have equal access to affordable housing, healthy foods, employment, transportation, and more. Key concepts for equity in the plan include restoring the growth corridor in East County, racial and socioeconomic integration as part of complete communities, more transit and walkability, more housing for everyone everywhere, and these are all integral to more racially and socially equitable outcomes now in the future. Thrive also places a historical lens on equity and includes a discussion on how redlining, restrictive covenants, discriminatory lending practices, exclusionary zoning, and other land use policies have helped to create and reinforce racist structures and perpetuate inequities. To put a finer point on the historical lens on equity, I think it's also important to note our role at the planning department in perpetuating these equities. At the root of Thrive is an effort to make our communities more equitable and inclusive by addressing the historical discriminatory aspects of zoning. So through the Thrive effort and other efforts that we're working on, we recognize the role that Montgomery planning has played through plans and policies that have created and perpetuated racial inequity in the county. We have a long history of land use decisions that have created exclusionary neighborhoods and formed barriers to resources and opportunities for people of color. But to be clear, Thrive will not solve inequity in the county, but we think it's one step of many we hope to take to begin to address the barriers in place that exist for many households in Montgomery County to securing housing. Beyond the historical lens on equity and housing, and the last thing I say about equity, I promise, until the questions at least, is that before we get into the content, I want to talk about the more housing of every kind approach that Thrive took, which is essential for gains for racial and socioeconomic equity and affordability. When developing the plan, we asked ourselves the simple question, is the status quo working? And the answer, of course, is no. And I hope that everyone here watching tonight can at least agree to that point. We can debate the details of Thrive, which I'm sure we'll do tonight, but our housing crisis is getting worse. We have growing disparities in this county through home ownership, how many renters are cost burdened, and the vehicle and things like the vehicle miles traveled to get to jobs. And we need to create a vision where we can help reverse this. There is no reality where we do nothing and our housing affordability crisis gets better. There's no reality. Thrive's housing chapter is a housing element. It purposely addresses all elements of housing, including affordable and market rate housing, preservation and production, as well as zoning, financial, and policy tools under the recognition that we need all of these elements together to begin to address our housing crisis. And if Thrive is implemented, and we'll talk about the policies and practices to implement the plan in a second, our belief is that our neighborhoods will become more equitable through the vision Thrive sets forward for vibrant, walkable, affordable, mixed income communities. And so we talked about that equity lens on Thrive, and now I want to give a little bit of background on the approach that was taken in writing policies and practices in the chapter. The Housing for All chapter was not written in isolation at the planning department. It was a collaborative exercise where we worked with and learned from our partners at other agencies, nonprofit, for-profit, and advocacy organizations, and their feedback was valued and integrated into the document. At the planning department, we've also completed a lot of studies on housing, things like the rental housing study, the preservation of affordable housing study, the housing needs assessment. They gave us a lot of data and insight to existing conditions, as well as recommendations to build upon. We also learned from national and jurisdictional best practices from institutions like Brookings and Urban Institute in counties and cities like Minneapolis, Arlington County, and Washington, D.C. And as I mentioned, the Housing for All chapter was written with a more of everything approach to housing. The chapter focuses on increasing production of both market rate and affordable housing, building more types of housing, preserving existing affordable housing, among others. And I'll say this, I know that there's been a lot that's been said about Thrive's proposal to encourage more missing middle types of housing, like duplexes and triplexes. But I hope that you realize, and you'll see tonight, that that recommendation is one of many in the plan. The reality is that our housing shortage is too big to be solved with one idea, and we need to do a lot of different things to produce more housing for all kinds of people. So the next 3 slides go into the content that's embedded in Thrive. These are policies and practices that we think will help solve our housing problems. So we have the first goal of encouraging the production of more housing to better match the supply with demand, and we have policies and practices like increasing residential density, increasing the number of income-restricted housing units, building deeply affordable housing and permanently supportive housing, accommodating innovative construction types, prioritizing the use of public land for co-location, incentivizing the redevelopment of office parks and other underutilized properties, and providing financial and other incentives to boost housing. Under the goal of planning for a wide range of housing types and sizes to meet diverse needs, we have policies and practices like facilitating the development of a variety of housing types, supporting creative housing, including duplexes and ADUs, but also co-housing and cooperative housing. We also have consider social housing to provide long-term affordability, encourage the provision of multi-bedroom units for families, and to integrate people with disabilities and people transitioning from homelessness and older adults into appropriate housing. Under the goal of promoting racial and economic diversity and equity in every neighborhood, we have policies like retooling the applicability of the moderately priced dwelling unit program and other affordable programs. We want to develop strategies to minimize gentrification and displacement, refine regulatory tools and other incentives with the goal of avoiding a net loss of market rate income restricted affordable housing. We want to identify and allocate additional resources for the Housing Initiative Fund, which is the county's housing trust fund. We want to increase access to home ownership and improve the collection of data on neighborhood change to monitor and address involuntary displacement and disinvestment. So those were the policies and practices in Thrive. And so we also want to measure, how are we going to get there? How can we measure our progress to meeting these goals? So Thrive also includes metrics to evaluate progress on meeting our housing goals. These metrics are used to measure progress in implementing the chapter's ideas. No plan that is designed to provide guidance over a period of time can anticipate every difficult problem, attractive opportunity, or useful idea that may emerge. So these metrics should be used to assess new proposals as well as measuring success or failure of the plan's recommendations over time. I won't go into read all of these because I know there's a lot, and I'm sure that you've all read the document, all 140 pages of front to cover. The chapter includes metrics like the number of and proportion of cost burden households, number of affordable units, and the range of home prices by housing types. And so the indicators listed on the screen are intended to guide how these types of issues and potential responses should be evaluated and allow for periodic assessment of progress to inform priorities and set shorter term goals. There's also a separate supporting document for Thrive called the Actions document, which highlights concrete actionable ideas for implementation of the policies and practices in Thrive. The actions list is not an exhaustive list of all possible actions that we can take, but these actions will need to be updated regularly as new tools and resources become available to respond to changing conditions over the life of this plan. So I want to highlight a couple of them. Again, this is not exhaustive, but I think they kind of, you can see the depth that we're trying to achieve change. And they include things like streamlining the review process, changes to the moderately priced dwelling unit program to reach broader levels of affordability, generating additional funding for the Housing Initiative Fund, and creating a community land trust, working with Prince George's County to get a set aside for the 9% low-income housing tax credit affordable housing program, and creating a no net loss of affordable housing floating zone. Again, not exhaustive, but you can see examples of how we're trying to achieve our housing policies and goals. So that's the end of my presentation. I want to thank you all for giving me the opportunity to talk about the Housing for All chapter in Thrive. And I want to end with this, that the title of this webinar is Will Thrive Montgomery 2050 Actually Help? And I hope tonight your takeaway is that yes, it can help, but it requires successful implementation, collaboration, buy-in from folks like you, and advocacy from folks like you to help push these ideas forward. Thrive doesn't have one housing idea that is going to fix everything. Instead of, it's made of a lot of incremental changes that can help us over the decades to address our housing crisis. And in terms of next steps for the plan, Thrive Montgomery is currently at the County Council for review. There's actually a work session tomorrow if you're interested, but beyond that, I don't know much about the schedule. I also want to end that while I think that we have written a comprehensive housing element. Obviously I'm biased, I worked on it, but we have a vested interest in getting this right. So if anyone watching tonight has ideas that you think of things that we missed, things that you think that we should include, let me know, let your council member know, let council staff know, because like I said, we want to get this right. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And now it is my pleasure to invite Robert Goldman to present.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Robert Goldman, President of Montgomery Housing Partnership. First of all, I want to thank the League of Women Voters for putting this on, and we have a long history of work with the League, and they've been a huge proponent of affordable housing for a very long time. And so I want to just recognize their work around affordable housing in Montgomery County. So, you know, Lisa really is the expert on this stuff. So I feel bad that I have to go after her. And so I'm going to give sort of a few random things I'm going to talk about, all which sort of are about Thrive or the context around which Thrive is being talked about. And hopefully it all makes sense. And so first I'm going to just quickly about MHP. We are been around for a little over 30 years and started, our first president actually was a former head of the planning board. As I said, our mission is to develop quality, affordable housing in Montgomery County. The way we talk about it is housing people, empowering families, and strengthening neighborhoods. And so we, in terms of housing people, we own and developed over 2,200 units of affordable housing in Montgomery County, serving 4,000 families. Our, you know, almost all our work has been in Montgomery County, but in the last few years, we've also expanded some of our work in Prince George's County and DC. And currently we're working on a project. We bought actually a portfolio of 3 properties, which we are in the process of renovating. 515 Thayer, Hillwood Manor, we just closed on the renovation for that. And Forest Glen, which we actually right near the Forest Glen Metro, taking, I want to say, not 90 unit property and turning it into almost 200 units. And then, you know, but our work is more than housing. We work with the families that live there. We serve over 350 kids. We have a number of programs, a preschool program. We have an after-school program for elementary school kids. We have a middle school program. We do stuff for adults in terms of ESOL classes and other things like that. And then we also work to strengthen neighborhoods around where affordable housing is located, small business support, leadership development, physical improvements, et cetera. And obviously one thing I'm going to talk about is the pandemic and COVID. And so part of our work has also been to work with the residents to help them get through it. And so we've helped get residents get about over $2.5 million in assistance. We've connected 400 people with with public assistance, helped administer more than 1,000 free COVID tests, and provided more than 1,000 people with COVID vaccines. So in terms of what's going on in the county, the poverty rate in Montgomery County is almost 7%, 18.5% below 200% of the poverty. Costs $91,000 to be self-sufficient in Montgomery County. 46.5%, almost 47% of renters are cost burdened. Means they pay more than 30% of their income towards rent. 85, if you look at just people $50,000 and under, 85% of those renters are cost burdened. And we're really facing, I don't know if this is a post-pandemic thing, but rents are rising. Like I've seen, around the country, rents rising more than 40%. So we've sort of held back. We've limited rent increases during the pandemic, but that will be lifted shortly, and expect rents to be really rising. The median price of a detached house is $875,000. Construction costs are rising. You have the supply chain issues, making it much more expensive to develop affordable housing. And interest rates are rising, meaning that our cost to borrow debt is rising too. And so all this is putting pressure. If we want to develop affordable housing, it's putting pressure on us to find ways to fund affordable housing. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to do that. Add to that, inflation and everything else that residents are facing, as well as owners of affordable housing are facing. The pandemic, about 18% of renters are probably still delinquent in paying rent. Low-income residents are still struggling to get jobs, even though the media says there's plenty of jobs out there. It's still a struggle. I think the pandemic highlighted food insecurity in Montgomery County. I mean, you saw, we had a number of sort of food events to make sure that people got food. I think as Lisa mentioned, there's a lot of inequities in Montgomery County. There's a long history in our zoning laws and other things that has led to some serious inequities in Montgomery County. And we saw that during the pandemic in terms of who got impacted the most, who lost their job the most, and things like that. And then I think the pandemic, in my mind, highlighted just the fact that place-based, we really need to be focusing on place-based services and bringing services to where residents live. Just having a place and telling people that they just come to Rockville and get your services. People can't, it's not that easy to do. And we find that there's it adds to the barriers of people getting the services that they need. A little context on, sort of what kind of precursor to sort of Thrive is that the county, the COG, the Council of Governments, kind of created regional housing goals with the effort that to say looking at sort of our projected growth around the region. We have to add at least 320,000 housing units to the region between 2020 and 2030. And then for Montgomery County, it equates to 40,000 housing units by 2030. 75% should be in activity centers or near transit, and 75% should be affordable to low and moderate middle income households. And I think the one takeaway too from those studies that COG did is, as they looked at growth, much of the growth that is happening in Montgomery County is at lower income jobs and not at the higher end, which means there's going to be a great need for affordable housing. I won't go through all this because Lisa has, but Thrive has a number of recommendations around affordable housing in terms of sort of, as she said, the variety of affordable housing, matching supply with demand, racial equity, financial incentives, and things like that. So, and people ask me, I was on another panel talking about Thrive, and I sort of just blurted out, like, people ask, like, well, what do I think Thrive is going to do? And in one level, Thrive is not going to do much of anything. And at another level, Thrive is going to do a lot in terms of affordable housing. And what do I mean? None of Thrive, this is a plan. It's a general plan. It's and so it doesn't do anything. It doesn't give us more funding. It doesn't, create more zoning. It just says, this is what we'd like to do. So the day after Thrive is, passed, hopefully it passes, day after, we don't have any more effort to get affordable housing. But on the flip side, I would say it's important to have plans. It sets the tone of where we're going as a county. It's a long-term plan. It's not a short-term plan. So even if like a bunch of NIMBY council members got elected in the next election, the plan goes beyond them. And so we have to take the long-term view on this. And it has a number of very good recommendations. Lisa's explained those things. I don't know how, other than the middle missing housing, missing middle and all that, which I know this has its controversies, but all these things are like, if you want affordable housing, it's pretty basic stuff and probably doesn't even go far enough, but it's a good start. So, again, some of the things in terms of increasing funding for the HIF, which is our housing production fund, very important. Avoiding net loss of market rate housing. We're looking at the, as the purple line is being built, we're very concerned right now about what is the future for Long Branch. And, as people buy up parcels, redevelop them, what's going to happen? Will there be a loss of market rate affordable housing? And so there's a big effort to preserve affordable housing along the purple line. And then expanding access to home ownership. So, I also want to talk about some council actions that, in some ways are further as sort of it's before kind of the cart before the horse, but like it's already been done. And so, but these are things that probably also in Thrive, or Thrive takes a little further. But just to give people a context of what's been happening, the council has eased requirements, restrictions on building accessory dwelling units. So that will help. The council created with the executive's recommendation, an acquisition fund, affordable housing opportunity fund and funded with $14 million, which will help us acquire property, especially along the purple line. The budget for the production of affordable housing is $43 million. That is not enough. The DC has been doing over $100 million for a number of years, and now is putting even more than that in there. So we really need, if there's one thing out of all this we can get, is increasing the funding for affordable housing. At the end of the day, that's what it's going to take. The council recently expanded pilots. They sort of had an extensive pilot program for affordable housing. They took some parts away. We all complained. And after a couple of years, they've now gone back to with the original plan, which is to provide full pilots for affordable housing. And the last thing I'll say, we're seeing a number of actions by the council, all very good things, like the climate change, the BEPS, the building standards. We got window guards to protect young children, very important. Mandatory air conditioners, very important. Trying to increase wages for construction workers, very important. All these things are very important, but they also have an impact on the developing of affordable housing. And if we're going to do those things, which we all should do, we got to pay for it, right? We can't just say, go do it, because what you're really doing is that when you don't fund it, is what you're really saying is when it's going to come at the expense of affordable housing. And that's not fair to affordable housing and the need for affordable housing. And it's, we can't just stick our head in the sand and say, we're going to ignore the fact that these things have costs. And so I just sort of want to point out that there's a number of things going on, all good things, and we're all for it. But we should also be thinking about what is the impact of other measures we do on affordable housing. And then last thing, some council actions that, while the Thrive was happening, I know Councilmember Joando had a bill to introduce a ZTA that would allow duplexes and townhomes in the R60 zones around Metro. and Councilmember Reamer and Hucker have asked the planning board to develop recommendations for the council to take up after Thrive around those missing middle housing. So there was some anxious people wanting to do the missing middle. I think they all decided wait till Thrive passes and then let's figure out what legislation we should do. And so lastly is just sort of things that we are promoting in terms of legislation before the council. $50 million county bond for affordable housing, set aside 10% of state and county ARPA funds. Those are the federal funds for during the pandemic that was given to each jurisdiction. Set aside 10% of that for housing. Many jurisdictions have done that. Zoning incentives to encourage affordable housing. We've been working with the state, trying to advocate, as in Virginia, a special allocation of low-income housing tax credits for Maryland counties in the National Capital Area. We're right now advocating before the state legislature for $33 million increase in the state rental housing works program. That's a very important program for developing affordable housing. And then, as I've been mentioning, Lisa mentioned, efforts around preservation along the purple line. So a lot of things happening. Happy to answer any questions. I appreciate the opportunity to talk.
Thank you, Robert. Finally, it is my pleasure to invite Stacy Spann to present. Stacy?
Sure, thank you. So I am going to just do a takeoff of what Rob was pointing out. And I'd like to point out that Rob Goldman tries to downplay his passion around these things, and yet always hits the almost the right note. Certainly, as much as we disagreed on this housing stuff, we agree on virtually every single point. And so the things I want to add are around the plan itself. It's not prescriptive. It provides general guidance, as both Lisa and Rob have said, gives us a good blueprint for the future. But it also challenges the county to examine and evaluate who we are and our values as an entire community. Super important. And I think I'll do a plug. Lisa, you said you were tired of talking about you would talk about the equity thing only one more time. I have to tell you that is one of those principles around fairness and around whole community. And so I'm appreciative that you all and this entire community have really focused on equity, racial, socioeconomic, as well as some of the environmental inequities in housing, because that recognizes the value of citizens of all incomes and skill sets, and the need to maintain a robust economy. And as you pointed out, this is all aligned with emerging best practice and is consistent with efforts to provide the best quality of life for all Montgomery County citizens. But it also sort of underlying all of that is this notion that limited investment in a spectrum of housing really stifles the ability of persons with limited means to fully participate, but also to scale this ladder of opportunity. And ultimately, if we do that, even inadvertently, it adversely impacts the county economy over time. So Rob started pointing out some of the issues that we're seeing. Bottom line is that all signs are pointing toward continued rise of housing prices and a dearth of housing unit supply at really all levels. He talked about rents looking like 40% in some areas of the country. Absolutely true. Class B rents on average in this area, suburban Maryland, have fully recovered from any pandemic impact, and they're around 11% increase. At the same time, renovation is slowing. So those Class B, Class C properties that you see are not seeing the same sort of investment. And in fact, about 8,700 Class B units are under renovation in the metro area. That's up from 7,700 this same time last year. However, it's significantly lower than the 10-year average of just under 20,000 units under renovation, right? So that is significant. And some of it has to do with supply chain issues. Some of it has to do with interest rate upticks. and availability of capital. And then, frankly, some of it has to do with the fact that many owners are trading out of properties. And so that also is having a significant increase impact on rents. Additionally, Class B low-rise apartments in suburban Maryland, those rents are up 10.3%, with virtually every single submarket posting rental gains. In fact, there are only two that posted a gain below 5%. Montgomery County increased at about 13%, which is huge. And then the Silver Spring and Wheaton submarkets had the highest increases at just under 16% in rents. And so, this is, we're talking about folks who are already cost burdened are going to be further cost burdened. And then I would add to that, what we're seeing is tightening vacancy rates across the metro area to include suburban Maryland. We've got, we average vacancy of 1.7 and 2.8 for low rise, 1.7% and 2.8% for low rise and mid/high rise properties. And that is a number that we really need to watch, particularly because there in fact may not be the level of supply that we'd like to see. In fact, there are other studies that are pointing out that the actual supply of units, the years of apartment supply in Class A has tightened significantly, and then in many cases there's significantly less supply that at less than at greater than 1 year across our region. And so some of that is the constraint of interest rates. Some of it is the pipeline dried up a bit during the early part of the pandemic, and it takes a little while to gen it back up. Of course, it's difficult to gen it back up if in fact there's no capital or there's limited capital. And certainly when we start to talk about affordable housing, the lack of capital is problematic. And then I want to just touch on some solutions that both Rob and Lisa mentioned, but coming out of this plan, there has to be strong, consistent policy that is supportive for mixed income housing, paying particular attention to the most affordable. There has to be fervent public support. And there also has to be significant and unwavering political support and will. And then finally, there have to be developers like MHP and HOC who are taking real estate approaches rooted in true equity, thinking about those persons who are most challenged and thinking about how to connect them with housing opportunity. And then I'd say finally, and Rob pointed this out in some of his insistence around the legislature, and that is there actually has to be real capital availability and the opportunity for deployment. And I point out the opportunity for deployment because too many times we talk about, this plan is only going to do this one thing, or this plan is only going to do these two things. Lisa and Rob both have, I think, been incredibly consistent in pointing out how necessary it is to take what is the guiding light, the plan, and then infuse it with this sort of buttressing level of support around financing these goals, and they're long term, and the needs are at this moment significantly greater than the supply of affordable housing, as well as in some cases support in areas of the county. So I'll just I know that we're getting a little short on time and people are eager to ask some questions. So with that, I'll turn it back over.
Thank you, Stacy. I will now move on to the Q&A portion of the evening, and we have several questions already. As a reminder, we encourage you to ask questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Type your question on the box, then hit send or return. We will answer as many questions as time allows. This program is scheduled to end at 8:30, so we do have some time. So Amelia Rust is going to be our Q&A moderator. Take it away, Amelia.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you to all of our presenters. So yes, I'm going to kick off the Q&A portion. Once again, if you have a question you would like to ask our presenters, you can do so by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom, typing in your question and hit send or return. We will try to answer as many questions as we have time for, but we are scheduled to end at 8:30. So our first question, which was touched on briefly, so anyone on the panel, feel free to answer this. How will Thrive Montgomery address the combination of NIMBYs, or not in my backyards, as it's called, individuals and local governments that may exclude transit-oriented developments or equitable developments?
So I'll start. So the answer for jurisdictions like Rockville and Gaithersburg, we do not have zoning authority over those jurisdictions. So the Thrive will not address those jurisdictions. For NIMBYism, obviously there is NIMBYism in this community among many communities in the United States. One of the things that the Fed committee decided that I really think is important is that housing is a human right, and that all of the housing policies operate under this principle that housing is a human right. And I think that if we could get buy-in on that, and we can get buy-in on the idea that this can really help make a dent, I think that could be helpful. Obviously, we have the planning department itself has a lot of goodwill that they need to build in order to help get that buy-in, but it's not going to be easy. I'll say that. I think, I think of developments like Chelsea Heights, that is a townhouse development in Silver Spring that had to reduce the number of units and then the number of affordable units in order to get built. And we don't want to see that happen in the advent of Thrive or in any of our developments. We want to see more housing getting built, but I think that it is a challenge. I'll admit that, and I don't have all of the answers. I hope Stacy and Robert might have some so that I can learn from them, like I have for the past 6 years I've had this job. So I'll turn it over to them.
I think you're right. I mean, look, it's a great question, right? How do we win the hearts and minds of our neighbors who are skeptical about the impact of this on the neighborhoods and the broader community? And there's no easy answer, right? I think you're starting to see it, and this planning department has been as vulnerable as any I've seen. It's a tough job. To open yourself to that level of critique when you're really trying to think about how to position this community for success into perpetuity, right? And I think it starts there. We have to actually acknowledge that, in fact, that's what everybody's trying to do, and it takes us bumping up against one another and unfortunately having disagreement around some of the principles, but there have to be some very, very basic things that we agree on. And I think that establishing the norm that housing is a human right is an incredible start, right? That's great. And let's add to that, right? These communities should be well designed. They should be places where we all want to live, that are representative of the level of diversity this community boasts and uses as an incredible opportunity to continue said success. We should be thinking about how that lands on children, and how any sort of disparity in housing type and construction type, and how we manage neighborhoods, and therefore how our neighbors view us, lands on those children every single day, not just within the immediate community, but when they've got to go to school, when they've got to operate with their classmates. And then housing for my kids offers a place of respite, a place of solace, but also a place of recovery. And that ought to be the same for every kid in Montgomery County. We ought to be thinking that way for every child here, and working in a way to make that the reality.
Hard to go after Lisa, but it's even harder to go after Stacy. But I will say that I think we are progressing as a county. I think in terms of NIMBYism, I think some of the old fights I see now, even on my own listserv, where people are trying, instead of everyone being a NIMBY, people are starting to say, hey, this is something we need in our community. And I've seen that around affordable housing. I've seen that about other things. But I think in the end, I think this is what you maybe have been alluding to, Stacy. This is a plan for 2050, right? So the planning department's challenge is like, they've got to think ahead, all these years. The people we're living today. And it's hard to think through what's the dynamic, but the reality is this county is growing. And all the dynamics, all the studies that they have gotten, they're coming true to some degree, one way or another. We're seeing the growth. And so whether we want to admit it today or we're going to admit it 10 years from now, but these things are, it's not rocket science. At the end of the day, this is going to happen. And I think and maybe it's just a matter of bringing people along. And as I said, I think some of these things that have been talked about in this plan were talked about years ago, and it was probably ahead of its time. And then we've come, through lots of conversations and through lots of dialogue and et cetera, people have come and changes in circumstances, et cetera, people have begun to realize, that, and have begun to accept these things. And so we'll just have to continue to have these dialogues. And the reality is it's not going away. We can pretend it's not going to happen, and we can stay in our little bubble of today, but the reality is it's happening. And we just, one day we're going to have to say, whether it's today or whenever, we got to address it.
Great, thank you. Our next question, can Montgomery County afford a plan like Thrive 2050 without either raising taxes or raising the current constant yield rates?
So it's a great question again. I mean, we get to the practicality of the thing, right? And it can't afford not to do it is ultimately the answer. This is an area of the country where people are clamoring to live, period. And in order to continue to bask in that and grow that, it requires investment. Housing is part of infrastructure, and it's one of the most necessary forms of infrastructure. The fact of the matter is, if we're not growing a significant class of young persons who can rent and then ultimately graduate into home ownership and others, then you're not growing your tax base. And that's what it is. I mean, we're constantly competing with every single jurisdiction who are our neighbors. And yes, we can think about regionalism. That's awesome, right? And so we're trying to make this region strong and keep it strong. And at the same time, we're trying to steal every citizen, every soul, every business we can from our neighboring counties. It's just a fact. And Montgomery County has been leading the pack for so long, that I think it's easy to sort of lose sight of the fact that we're in a competition, and we're in that competition every single second of every single day.
Yeah, and I think, and Amazon was a classic example. The winning bidders we talked about affordable housing and have developed plans and are developing and talking about affordable housing and how that fits. And and we're getting beat and by folks who are out, who see it, who see the future, recognize that to be a successful community, they need to be, and to grow their tax base, they need to be thinking about all the things in this plan and implementing the things in this plan. And so again, yeah, I think what Stacy says, right, spot on. If we want to grow as a, the alternative to increasing taxes is to increase your tax base. And this plan is one way to help you get there.
I'll second everything that they've said. And just one of those studies that I talked about earlier is we had an older adult housing study in Montgomery County, and we found out that we are one of the oldest jurisdictions in the region by far. So we need to grow our tax base, and housing is our Achilles heel. We have great amenities, we have a great quality of life, but if people can't afford to live here, and I'll speak for myself as a millennial who lives in an apartment downtown Silver Spring, I love it, but I want to place roots in the community that I've grown to love over the past 6 years. And right now it's not feasible. And it's the same story for a lot of my friends too. So I think Thrive's a start, but we got to implement some ideas in order to be able to attract the workforce that we need.
Great, thank you all. I'm going to kind of combine a couple of questions. How does the county plan to, would it plan to incorporate Thrive with zoning text amendments that may be getting passed before Thrive is approved? And what role has zoning in general played in the availability of affordable housing in the county up until now?
Sure, so I'll take that one. So I was reading the questions. I know I noticed a theme in a lot of the questions about the planning department's attainable housing strategies that Mr. Goldman hit on earlier. So give a very short background. Last March, so basically a year ago, the county council gave the planning department a work program item to basically study the need for diverse housing types and to come up with, they asked us to transmit a zoning text amendment. This came on the heels of Councilmember Jawando's missing middle ZTA and Councilmember Reamer's draft zoning text amendment about missing middle along corridors. So the planning department studied that issue. We've been working on it for about a year. We're in the heel stretch, but we will not transmit it until the adoption of Thrive 2050. If this council does not act on Thrive, we will not transmit our recommendations. And I will say I've worked on a lot of zoning text amendments. There are a lot of big ideas in attainable housing strategies, but as with all zoning text amendments, there will be compromises if it passes. So there's still a lot of work to be done, at least 2 public hearings. And that's getting ahead of myself because, like I said, we're not even going to transmit it until after the adoption of Thrive. What was the second part of the question?
So I believe the question was, how will you square Thrive with zoning text amendments that may be happening up until Thrive is passed, and what role zoning has played in the availability of affordable housing overall?
Sure. So I answered the first part about, kind of the process for the attainable housing strategy zoning text amendment. Zoning plays a big part in limiting the availability of land. Less than 5% of our land is zoned for commercial residential, which is our mixed use zone that allows us to build those tall buildings. The vast majority, over 1/3 of the county, is set aside for single family detached units by right. So if you think about it, we have 1/3 of our land for the ag reserve, 1/3 of single family, and then 1/3 for everything else like schools, multifamily, churches, commercial, malls, everything else. So we have artificially constrained over 1/3 of our land for single family zoning. And so that's what we're doing at the planning department, is how can we study changes to incrementally change this to allow more housing choice in many of our single family neighborhoods.
Great, thank you. Our next question is specifically for Robert. Someone asked if you could please summarize some of your concerns that you may have about developing housing along the Purple Line.
Yeah, what I was talking about is, so the Purple Line is, I don't know, I guess it's back on and it's happening, and we will have light rail at some point. And I think examples from around the country show that when you build transit, such as the Purple Line, that it leads to sort of, higher costs, higher housing costs. Landlords, all of a sudden, some rundown apartment building, before the Purple Line is built, all of a sudden after it's charging one rent. After the Purple Line is built, they haven't done anything to their building, but all of a sudden they have a huge amenity, the Purple Line, that they can now sort of market, and all of a sudden will increase the rent. Furthermore, what you see is developers buying up land around the Purple, around transit places, and then redevelop sites, and then charge market rate high-end housing, and so that would displace many of the people that live there. And so there's been a big effort to try to have some I think in the plan it talks about no net loss, so I think there's been efforts to see if there was a way to have development there, but at the same time have preserve a certain amount of affordable housing in one fashion or another, so that when the new community's there's been no net loss of affordable housing. And so it's a real concern. And we've been, I think, in my opinion, late to the game in terms of doing what we can to preserve properties along the Purple Line. Maybe it's fortunate in that regard that things got delayed in the sense that maybe gave a little more time to do some things, but at the same time, obviously, the Purple Line is important. I am all for the Purple Line. Please don't interpret this in a negative way. I think the Purple Line is important. I think it's important for the very reason that people who live there need to benefit. They need transportation. They're taking X number of buses to get to jobs, and so this provides a great opportunity for a range of people in different incomes to be able to have access to jobs and other things. And it would be a shame if we spent all these billions of dollars to build the Purple Line and then it displaced the very people that was meant to help. And so we need to be thinking about just how we find that balance between development and preventing displacement.
And can I add to that, Rob? I know it was for you, but it's
Sure.
just one of along the Purple Line, and he talked about it beautifully. The one thing he didn't mention is that there are trades happening in the Class B, Class C space. So what that means is that the investors aren't simply buying up vacant land. They're buying existing assets that are currently now housing folks at a market rate of rent. So it's affordable to people right now. And generally, when that frenzy starts to happen along something like a Purple Line, the investors are betting that they can actually do some modest, or in some cases, significant improvements, or raise structures entirely and redevelop, and then charge Class A rents. And here's part of the analysis, and this is sort of no net loss, right? You want to have a robust preservation program at the same time as you develop and figure out how to support a robust new construction in order to meet the need. Because if you're losing units, then you've got to now develop more units or just be in a perpetual state of loss. I mean, it's always a sort of net gain. But when we're thinking about Class B and C properties, the vacancy rates in Class B and C properties typically trail Class A properties by 200 basis points less. So in the market, I was just giving you a bunch of statistics when I did my presentation. And essentially what you're seeing is in this current market, you'll see vacancy rates at around 3 to 4% for Class A. And you're seeing 2%, 200 basis points less than that for Class B and C because it's significantly more affordable. Simple, right? And so when that stock gets purchased and investors go in and actually enhance the space, then they're trying to command additional rent because now you've squeezed out the available, affordable Class B and C opportunities for folks, right? That's where an MHP and an HOC, that's where those folks come in, because they have a significant preservation mandate at the same time as they're aggressively pursuing new construction.
The only thing that I'll add there, I agree with both of their points, is we recently did a preservation study, and we found out the leading indicator for preservation loss is transit, especially new transit infrastructure. We know that. And so knowing that, we're armed with knowledge, we just have to do something to make sure that we don't lose those units, because like Stacy and Rob said, we're not going to get them back. And so when Thrive has an idea of like a no net loss of affordable housing floating zone, that's a tool that we can use to help negotiate for no net loss. It's something we did in the Veers Mill master plan too, but we need to implement those tools to make sure that they get done.
Great, thank you. I was hoping you, maybe Lisa, this might be best for you. If you could clarify, first of all, at what point in the Thrive Montgomery 2050 planning work session conversation timeline, the OLO's recent racial equity and social justice report was factored in? And now that that report has been released, if the planning board or if the county is planning to take any new actions with regards to engaging low-income communities, communities of color, non-English speaking communities, and anyone else who the report may have indicated could see possible negative side effects from Thrive 2050.
Sure, that's a great question. So after the FED work sessions, FED is the Planning, Housing, and Economic Development Committee at the Montgomery County Council. After they completed their work sessions on Thrive, they then asked OLL to do an equity analysis of the report, which they completed a couple of weeks ago. And OLO basically determined it's hard to judge Thrive because of the way that it's a general plan, but they did outline, concrete things that we should consider. And currently the county council is currently considering those steps, whether it includes, more outreach, hiring a consultant to help them, adding things to chapters that are more explicit about the history of exclusionary zoning, things like that. The planning department, while the plan is certainly, we are willing to work with the council and OLO to achieve those things. We think that we can work together to achieve an outcome and have a better, stronger Thrive at the end. But we won't know exactly what that looks like until tomorrow, it sounds like. So I'm not sure what the next actionable step will look like, but we'll have a discussion tomorrow at the full council work session.
Great. And people can find, if they wanted to watch that work session, is that one also going to be live streamed on the county government's website?
Sure, and I can put it in the chat if anyone's interested in watching.
Okay, great. Our next question, in many parts of the county, upzoning has resulted in developers tearing down the smallest and most affordable single-family homes in neighborhoods. It has also resulted in higher taxes in those areas. So how would this plan keep people of more moderate means in those homes instead of being pushed out, especially if those individuals are on fixed incomes?
Sure, so I think you're not required to sell your home. Thrive's not telling that you have to sell your home to a developer that's going to build it to a duplex. I think the issue and what's really the tension point is this is already happening in Montgomery County, as the commenter noted. We are seeing people that have modest starter level homes are selling them to a developer, a small LLC that then builds a McMansion that sells for 3 times the price. The issue is that's the only option right now. They only have the ability to buy, right, build a single family detached unit. And that because we know that size has the biggest impact on affordability, we know that townhouses and condos are more affordable than a single family detached home. We're trying to create a competitive option for this current process that already exists.
Great, thank you. I'm scanning the questions furiously. We've got quite a lot of them and about 20 minutes left in our program. One question says, most of the areas that are being targeted for Thrive proposals are already in the county's most racially and financially diverse areas. How does this correlate with your approach?
So I'm not 100% sure because Thrive is a county-wide plan. So theoretically, all policies should apply countywide. So maybe if the question, the person that asked the question can elaborate, I can better answer the question, but it's a countywide plan.
Okay. Oh, okay. Our next question says certain areas of Montgomery County seem to have perpetually overcrowded schools with little relief, while some other areas seem to get more attention, but school construction and capital budgeting for that is a decade plus project. So in developing Thrive 2050, how did the planning department coordinate with the school district to ensure that school capacity is sufficient for the county's children?
Sure. So first, I want to make sure that everyone is aware that we have a growth and infrastructure policy that makes sure that new development is aligned with school and traffic adequacy. And we just updated it 2020, the years are blending together, but we updated it fairly recent, but we will be kickstarting a new update every 4 years. So I think we have that policy to make sure that growth is in line with schools and transportation. We also met with MCPS over the plan development several times. My boss, Jason Sartori, he meets with MCPS regularly. They have a coordinating meeting monthly with MCPS to make sure that they're aware of the policies that are in Thrive and that we're aware of school planning facilities. So we always have that collaborative relationship. So I think we do work with MCPS when it's feasible and when we can.
Great, thank you. Our next question is the environmental assessment, especially for stormwater, already done on Thrive 2050? And what might that assessment shine a light on in terms of quality of life in future communities in the county?
So I do not work on the environmental section. I work on housing policy, but I do know the carbon footprint analysis was completed. And I can put my email in the chat, and if anyone's interested in reading that, I can certainly connect you to my colleague, Steve Finley, and they can read that. But that's the best I can do, I'm sorry.
Okay, great. So at this point, is there a clear timeline right now for when Thrive 2050, if it were approved, would begin, basically, and how soon new affordable units would come online?
Sure. So if Thrive is passed tomorrow, which will not happen, but hypothetically speaking, we would have to have a legislative body, probably the council or at the request of the planning board, introduce legislation in order to make changes to increase affordability. Like I said, Thrive's not a self-implementing policy, so it requires future steps like zoning text amendments, legislation, capital improvements, bills to have its ideas implemented. So, like Rob very well said, it does a lot, but it also does very little. So it's we'll have to work on the next steps if and when it gets adopted.
Great, thank you. This next question, hopefully everyone, hopefully Robert and Stacy could add some to this as well, but anyone can answer it. It says the answer may seem to be adding missing middle housing in single family neighborhoods, but would those areas be off limits to developing more missing middle housing?
Not sure what they're saying there.
I think there may have been an earlier part of this question. I think maybe an earlier part of the question was how many common ownership communities are in the county? How how much acreage is for R90 single detached zoning. How many acres are within municipalities? How many ADUs have been built since passing? And I think the second part to that question is the answer may seem to be adding missing middle housing in single family neighborhoods. Those areas would be off limits.
All right, so I think what Melissa's getting at, and I read the question, is there's a lot of areas that are not, that won't be touched by any zoning changes that the planning department or the planning board will introduce. That includes municipalities like Rockville and Gaithersburg. That includes a lot of home ownership association areas, a lot of zones like RE2 that with zoning changes are not being recommended in attainable housing strategies. So she's right that there are a lot that will whittle down the amount of acres. But when I did the analysis, I think it was around like, and this is talking about attainable housing strategies, which again is a separate project. There are about like 80,000 parcels, taking all of those things whittled out that could be potentially affected by a future zoning text amendment. So I think that is the answer, that yes, these areas will be cut down, but there's still a significant part of this county that's in R60, R90, and R200.
Okay, thank you. The next question, I believe, is directed at Robert. It says, you describe this plan as kind of a wish list, but says that it could do nothing. And the person who wrote that question also said that they can see how this general plan would promote density, but not how it would promote equity. Robert, do you think you'd be able to answer that one?
I'm not sure exactly what it's saying, but yeah, I mean, I think my point is that it's a plan, right? And so it's not until we implement and actually start building and all that stuff and funding that it becomes a reality. And so, we've got it, and so it doesn't implement any policy. It just creates a plan. Now, and to its benefit, a plan is good. It tells everybody this is where we're going, and hopefully brings a bunch of people along with them on that plan. And so that when it's time to do the next steps, people say, yeah, we said we were going to do this. Now let's implement it. Now let's pass that legislation. Now let's pass that ZTA, what have you, and it's in our plan, is consistent with what we've been talking about, and things like that. So, to that regard, it's helpful and important. My company, we do strategic plans every 5 years, and tells everyone, all our stakeholders, and where we're headed, and then we start to kind of work towards that. So it's an important first step, and I appreciate all the hard work that planning board did, the staff did to put this together.
Great, thank you.
Just real quickly, the point on equity, though, I mean, it doesn't prescribe what precisely must be done, but rather acknowledges past practice and policy that in fact was inequitable. I mean, it actually directly goes to it, and we're seeing that as national best practice, because you've got to actually acknowledge that, and then sets forth a way to really right size it and program housing that is appropriate for all incomes, all income levels, and then again across the county. It's not just focused on single areas and so forth. So I think the plan in and of itself gives a prescription, and as Rob has noted, and I think Lisa as well, it is for policymakers and funders and citizenry to come together and hash out the precise steps, as well as the order of steps, if there is to be one, necessary to make that plan closer to our reality.
Thank you. Next, I'm going to combine a couple of questions about the ag reserve. Is it realistic to preserve the agricultural reserve as it is now in the light of overwhelming demand for affordable housing coming down the pike? And also, what organizations in the agricultural reserve did the county consult when it was preparing Thrive 2050? And did they perhaps hold any listening sessions up there? The asker of that question is concerned that the plan as it is now does not reflect the reality of what it is like to live in the agricultural reserve.
Sure. Well, I'll start with a famous quote our planning director gave when we did a project and our consultant brought up the possibility of putting housing in the ag reserve. She said, "Them's fighting words." She said, "The agricultural reserve is a gem in Montgomery County and we want to preserve it." We think that we can make incremental changes to our zoning policy through single family zoning, increasing density in our commercial business areas, that we don't need to touch the agricultural reserve. It's important to the planning board, it's important to the community that we preserve this gem. So in terms of outreach, I can certainly put the outreach appendix in the chat. I know that we did, at the beginning of the kickoff of the plan, we did something called Thrive Week, where we had listening, or not a listening session, but we went out to a different community in each council district. There's 5 of them. And we definitely went up county, but I don't remember exactly where. If someone would like, from up county would like to talk to us about Thrive Now, we're certainly open to that and happy to have that conversation. I think that, it's important that all our residents feel that they engaged and they had a stake in this process. And so it's a little disappointing to hear, because I think we did do a phenomenal work on outreach, and I invite everyone to read the appendix, but we're always looking for ways to get better. So I hope that we can, next time we do this, meet the community where they are a little bit better.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for 1, maybe 2 questions if they're quick. So one person did ask, it appears that as the result of the pandemic, there could be an excess of office space. And so is it possible that any of that excess office space could be adapted for new housing? This is also something that I think is being explored in DC as well.
It's being explored here. We've done it here. I think, we have a lot of office vacancies in Montgomery County. We did before the pandemic, to be very clear, but a lot of it is in places like Rock Spring, which have really, really big office parks. Think of like the old Marriott headquarters that was 800,000 square feet. You can't adapt that to housing. They have to tear it down because there's no interior core for light. So it just makes an awkward layout that can't be set up. But we do have developers like, I think of like the Octave in Silver Spring, which was an adaptive reuse office building that was about 100,000 square feet that was adapted to entry-level starter home condos. So like we are actively pursuing that, and we will definitely continue to pursue that in light of the pandemic.
Well, I think that investors, developers are looking at the opportunities that they can convert as quickly as they can and get them up and running. It's not, unfortunately, this is a little more scientific than just picking a spot and saying we want to make it housing. And as a consequence, you've seen nationally where it makes sense, developers trending toward this opportunity that hopefully meets the need and some financing as well. Unfortunately, every office, as Lisa pointed out, every office opportunity is not appropriate. And in fact, there's some that are completely inappropriate. And many are car centric, so they don't get at the notion of transit oriented development. But there are some that will qualify, and those are still competing for in some cases office customers. So it's I think it's a great notion. It's certainly happening in our region and around the country. I think it'll pick up some steam, but I don't think we should be so quick to write the eulogy for office space. I mean, it's, these things ebb and flow, unfortunately, with space tightening and the pipeline drying up, mom and dad are going to get tired of working from home at some point and beg to go into the office in some instances. It certainly happened in my house. So, we should offer some room for that as well.
And so, and while we're on that topic, I'll just throw in a different topic, but related, taking advantage of opportunities, right? So, and I think the county has started to do this for a bit now and should really be thinking about expanding this. And that is co-locating affordable housing where other public sites are. So, MHP developed the Bonifant right next to the Silver Spring Library on the same land that the county owned. Great opportunity, built 149 units of housing right on the purple line. The stop will be right there, right by the downtown Silver Spring, right near the Silver Spring Metro, all those things. And we, are doing that in some other sites as well. And we should be looking to find other sites. So, at the end of the day, we got to be creative about how we do it. And so the office thing is an idea. And as they said, it works for some and doesn't work for others. And co-locating affordable housing with public sites are an important element too. And, I think the takeaway to me, after all these years I've been at this job, no one thing is going to solve the problem, right? This missing middle isn't going to solve all our problems. And, the accessory dwelling units and the MPDUs but it's everything. We got to be doing a lot of things all at once and to really tackle this problem because it's a huge problem. And so if we can do that, the offices and the public sites as well, let's add that to our tool belt.
Yeah, it definitely isn't everything. And I'll say that public sites, office sites, space in general is what we should be considering. What does it look like for the county to embark on an effort with developers, affordable developers in particular, to use the space above recreation centers, right? Those parking lots are empty for most of the day, most of the evening, beyond 5 p.m. Those are opportunities, particularly in communities that have real need for amenities like that. Because that changes communities, it changes the children who play and recreate their entire life trajectory. We know that it's the county is using its tax base to generate opportunity for folks, and so why not housing opportunity as well?
Great. Thank you all so much. I think we are winding down to the end of our program tonight, so I am going to wrap up the Q&A now and throw it back over to Nancy.
Well, that's all the time we have had for Q&A tonight. Very interesting, and thanks everybody for excellent questions, and of course our wonderful panelists. And thank you all to our esteemed presenters, and thank you to everyone watching tonight. If you enjoyed this free program and want to learn more about the League of Women Voters work in Montgomery County, you can find out more about us, including how to support our efforts at LWVMOCOMD.org. And with that, we will say thank you again and good night.